We're counting down the 25 forgotten trail lunches cowboys packed for a full day in the saddle. Long before drive-thrus and gas station jerky, a working cowhand rode 16 hours across Texas dust and Kansas grass with his whole noon meal tucked in a saddlebag or a coat pocket. The chuck wagon was often miles behind the herd, so whatever a man carried had to survive heat, sweat, and a hard trot without spoiling. From sun-hardened biscuits to dried fruit smuggled off the cook, each of these foods tells a story of thrift, grit, and the strange genius of feeding yourself from horseback. Some will turn your stomach, some will make your mouth water. Which forgotten trail lunch tops the list? Let's saddle up and begin the countdown with number 25. Number 25. Corn dodgers were the humblest thing a cowboy could carry, and often the first thing packed. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, and a little grease were mixed into stiff dough, shaped by hand, and baked hard in the ashes until they rang like stones. The cook, known across the trail as koozie or simply cookie, turned out a batch at dawn, and each rider tucked 2 or 3 into his vest before mounting up. They kept for days, never crumbled in a saddlebag, and filled a hungry belly through the long afternoon push. There was nothing tender about them. A cold dodger could nearly crack a tooth, and men soaked them in coffee to soften the bite. Yet cornmeal was cheap, traveled light, and never spoiled in the heat. For a cowhand earning around $30 a month, a pocketful of dodgers was breakfast, lunch, and insurance against a wagon that ran late. Number 24. Parched corn was the trail's original convenience food, a trick borrowed straight from the Plains tribes who crossed the same country. Dried corn kernels were tossed in a hot skillet or a bed of coals until they toasted, swelled, and turned nutty and golden. Cooled and poured into a small cloth sack, a handful could ride tied to a saddle horn for a week without going soft or sour. Cowboys chewed it slow through the dull hours on drag, the position at the back of the herd where a man ate more dust than dinner. It asked for no fire, no plate, and no pause in the work. The corn was light, cheap, and endlessly filling. Old trail diaries speak of riders whose only midday meal was parched corn and creek water, and who counted themselves lucky to have it when the beans ran short. Number 23. Pinole took parched corn one step further and turned it into a food a man could eat in the saddle without so much as reaching for a bag. The toasted kernels were ground fine, sometimes sweetened with a little sugar or spiced with cinnamon, then carried loose in a pouch. A cowboy would pour a spoonful straight into his mouth and wash it down, or stir it into a cup of water to make a thin, filling gruel. The Spanish-speaking vaqueros who rode the southern trails swore by it, and Anglo cowhands quickly learned the value of a food that was already cooked, already ground, and impossible to spoil. Pinole gave quick energy on a hard ride when there was no time to stop and eat. It weighed almost nothing, cost only the corn it came from, and could keep a rider going long after the biscuits were gone. Number 22. Hardtack earned its bad reputation honestly, yet it rode in more saddlebags than almost anything else. This was flour and water, baked into a plain, rock-hard cracker, dried until it could sit in a pack for months without a trace of mold. Soldiers had lived on it through the Civil War, and men drifting west after the fighting brought the habit with them onto the cattle trails. Cowboys called it worm castle and tooth dullers and worse because a dry piece truly could break a molar. The trick was patience. A man soaked it in coffee, in bacon grease, in stew, in anything wet, until it softened into something a jaw could manage. Bland and heavy, it was never anyone's favorite. But hardtack never quit on you. When fresh bread was 3 days behind on the chuck wagon, a saddlebag of hardtack was the difference between a full day's work and an empty stomach. Number 21. Cold salt pork, what the Cowboys plainly called "so-belly," was a saddlebag staple that fueled more river crossings than any tender cut ever did. Slabs of fatty pork were packed in barrels of salt so they could survive months without ice, and the cook fried off a mess each morning. Whatever a rider didn't eat at breakfast, he wrapped in a scrap of cloth and carried for noon. Cold and greasy, edged white with rendered fat, it was hardly elegant, but the salt kept it safe in the heat, and the fat gave a working man the calories he burned by the thousands chasing strays. Cowboys ate it straight, laid it between dodgers, or rubbed the grease onto dry bread. Sobelly was cheap enough to feed a whole outfit and rugged enough to ride 100 miles. On the trail, fat was not a sin. Fat was fuel. Number 20. Cold fried bacon, teasingly called overland trout by the men who ate it, was the taste of morning carried into the afternoon. Bacon was one of the few meats the chuck wagon could count on, salted and smoked so it kept without refrigeration in the worst of the summer heat. The cook fried it crisp at first light, and cowboys pocketed the extra strips wrapped in paper or a bandana to gnaw on somewhere out on the flank of the herd. Cold bacon lost none of its salt or its smoke, and the flavor held up beautifully against a mouthful of dry biscuit. Trail diaries joke about overland trout the way modern folks joke about mystery meat, but no one turned it down. It was portable, satisfying, and rich with the kind of energy a 16-hour day demanded. For many a rider, a strip of cold bacon and a hard biscuit was simply what lunch looked like. Number 19. Cracklins were the crunchy reward left behind when the cook rendered pork fat for lard, and a smart cowboy always angled for a share. Small pieces of skin and fat fried slowly until the grease ran out, and what remained was crisp, brown, and packed with salt and flavor. Cooled and carried in a twist of cloth, cracklins made a snack a man could dig into one-handed while his other hand held the reins. They were the happy accident of a frugal kitchen, since nothing on the trail was ever thrown away. The rendered lard went into biscuits and pie crust, and the cracklins went into the cowboys. Salty, rich, and full of the same fat that kept a rider warm through a cold night watch, they vanished from a pocket faster than almost anything. Old outfits remembered Cracklin' Day the way children remember candy, a small burst of pleasure in a hard and monotonous diet. Number 18. Cold roast beef seems obvious for men who spent their lives moving beef, yet fresh meat on the trail was rarer than you'd think. A drive existed to deliver cattle to market, not to eat the profit, so beef came mostly from a stray that broke a leg or a calf that couldn't keep up. When the cook did roast or boil a quarter, the leftovers were gold. Riders wrapped cold slices in cloth and carried them for noon, eating them with their fingers as the herd plodded north. The meat was lean, often tough, and always welcome after weeks of pork and beans. There was a quiet satisfaction in it, too. A cowhand pushing longhorns across 1,000 miles rarely got to taste the very thing he was driving. When he did, cold and plain out of a saddlebag, it felt like a small piece of the fortune riding on ahead of him. Number 17. Hoe cakes and Johnny cakes were the softer cousins of the corn dodger, and a good many cowboys preferred them for a pocket lunch. Cornmeal batter, thinned with water or buttermilk and a little grease, was poured onto a hot griddle and cooked into flat, golden rounds. The name Johnny cake was said to come from journey cake, and the meaning fit because these were made to travel. Slightly tender when fresh and still chewable when cold, they folded easily around a strip of bacon or a smear of molasses to make a rough sandwich. The cook could turn out a tall stack in minutes, feeding a whole outfit on a few cents of meal. Riders slid a couple into a coat pocket without a second thought. Simple as they were, hoe cakes carried the warmth of the breakfast fire out into the long afternoon, a small comfort a cowboy could hold in one hand. Number 16. Wild onions were the trail's accidental medicine, foraged straight from the prairie by men who never knew the word for scurvy. Weeks of biscuits, beans, and salt pork left a diet dangerously short on anything fresh, and cowboys craved the sharp, green bite of an onion the way a modern body craves a vegetable. Riders pulled wild onions and wild garlic from the grass as they moved, stuffing a few in a pocket to chew, along with a cold biscuit at noon. Some outfits carried raw onions from the last town for exactly this reason, prizing them far above their few cents cost. The strong flavor cut through the greasy monotony of trail food, and the men who ate them stayed healthier without ever understanding why. It was folk wisdom in its purest form, a small green habit that quietly kept a crew on its feet across a summer of hard, sun-blasted riding. Number 15. Dried apples were the sweetness a cowboy could count on, and a small sack of them rode in more saddlebags than almost any other treat. Fresh fruit rotted in a day on the trail, but apples sliced thin and dried in the sun shrank to leathery rings that kept for months and weighed next to nothing. A rider chewed them slowly through the dull afternoon, and the tart, concentrated sweetness was a genuine relief after a mouthful of salt and grease. The cook used them for pies and stewed fruit back at camp, but a handful eaten cold in the saddle needed no cooking at all. Dried apples were cheap, they traveled beautifully, and they carried just enough sugar to lift a tired man's spirits. On a diet built around beans and biscuits, a pocket of dried apples was the closest thing a cowboy had to dessert on the move, and it was cherished for exactly that. Number 14. Dried peaches earned an even higher place than apples in the affections of a trail crew, prized for a sweetness that bordered on luxury. Sun-dried into dark, chewy pieces, they held their flavor for the length of an entire drive and packed a richness that made the long hours a little shorter. Cowboys ate them straight from the sack, and cooks stewed them soft for the celebrated fried pies that men would ride out of their way to get. Because good dried peaches cost more than apples, an outfit that carried them was considered well provisioned, and the cook guarded the supply like treasure. A handful eaten in the saddle at noon was a small glowing reward for miles already ridden. Trail memories linger on that taste, the deep amber sweetness of a dried peach chewed under a hard sun, proof that even in a land of dust and beans, a little joy could be dried and carried along. Number 13. Beef jerky was the trail food that outlasted every other, and no cowboy rode far without a strip of it somewhere on his person. Thin ribbons of lean beef were rubbed with salt and hung in the sun and smoke until every drop of moisture was gone, leaving a hard, dark stick that could ride in a pocket for weeks. It weighed almost nothing, it never spoiled, and it packed pure protein into a form a man could chew one-handed at a full trot. When a stray steer had to be butchered on the trail, much of the meat that couldn't be eaten fast became jerky, a way of wasting nothing. Cowboys gnawed it through the driest afternoons, the salt drawing spit into a parched mouth, the chewing itself a way to pass the endless hours. Of everything a rider carried, jerky was the truest trail companion, tough and reliable as the men who ate it. Number 12. Pemmican was the borrowed genius of the frontier, a food the mountain men and plains tribes had perfected long before the first longhorn walked north. Dried meat was pounded to a powder, mixed with melted fat, and sometimes dried berries, then packed tight so it kept for months in any weather. The result was dense, greasy, and shockingly powerful, a few bites carrying the energy of a full meal. Cowboys who rode the far and lonely stretches, scouting ahead or drifting between outfits, valued pemmican for exactly that concentration. It never froze hard, never spoiled in the heat, and needed no cooking at all. A man could live on a small parcel of it for days. It was never pretty, and the taste took getting used to, but no other trail food packed so much survival into so little weight. Pemmican was the original ration, proof that the old ways still fed the new West. Number 11. Molasses, which the cowboy simply called lick, turned a plain cold biscuit into something worth looking forward to. A jug of thick, dark sorghum or black strap rode on the chuck wagon, and the cook doled it out sparingly because sugar of any kind was precious on the trail. Before riding out, a man might split a biscuit and let the lick soak in, then wrap it up for noon, or he would simply carry a biscuit and beg a spoonful when the wagon caught up. That sticky sweetness, poured slow and pooling into the bread, was one of the few genuine pleasures in a working day made of dust and cattle. Molasses was cheaper than white sugar and traveled without spoiling, so it became the sweetener of the entire cattle era. Old cowhands remembered the lick jug fondly, the way it made even the hardest, driest biscuit taste for a moment like something a mother might have made. Number 10. Airtight tomatoes were the strangest craving on the whole trail and one of the most beloved. Canned goods, which cowboys called airtights, were a marvel of the age, and a can of tomatoes could ride in a saddlebag until a man was ready to punch it open with his knife. Out in the alkali flats, where the water tasted of poison and thirst became a constant torment, a cowboy would tip a can of cool, acidic tomatoes down his throat and swear nothing had ever tasted so good. The liquid quenched a thirst that plain warm water couldn't touch, and the tomatoes gave the body something fresh in a diet starved of it. Cooks and cowhands alike stashed the cans for the dry stretches at 15 or 20 cents apiece. They weren't cheap, but on a burning afternoon 100 miles from a creek, a can of tomatoes was worth every penny. Number 9. Canned peaches were the airtight everyone hoped the cook had hidden away, the true luxury of the trail. If tomatoes were medicine for the dry country, peaches in heavy syrup were pure celebration, a taste of sweetness that a diet of beans and salt pork could never provide. A cowhand who found a can rattling in his war bag guarded it jealously, saving it for the worst day or the hardest crossing, then sharing it around the fire like a small holiday. The syrup was drunk to the last drop, too good to waste, because they cost real money and had to be freighted in from the railheads. Canned peaches marked an outfit that treated its men well. Trail memories are full of them, the way a can passed from hand to hand, each rider taking a careful bite. In a world of dust and endurance, a peach and syrup was a reminder that sweetness still existed somewhere. Number 8. Sardines rode in more pockets than you might expect, a small tin of oily fish that offered a change from the endless pork. Packed tight in oil and sealed against the world, sardines kept for ages and needed no fire, no plate, and no fuss. A cowboy pried the tin open with the same knife he used for everything else and ate the fish straight, the rich oil a welcome hit of fat and salt after hours in the saddle. Some men mashed them onto a biscuit or a cracker to stretch the meal. The little tins were light and cheap enough to stock up on in town, and they gave a rider something different to chew when the taste of bacon had worn thin. Trail cooks kept a supply for exactly that reason. On a diet defined by sameness, a tin of sardines was a small, salty rebellion, and the men savored it. Number 7. Cold frijoles rolled in a tortilla were the vaquero's gift to the whole cattle trade, the ancestor of a food half of America now eats without a thought. The Mexican cowhands who worked the southern drives cooked their pinto beans slow and thick, then spooned the leftovers onto a flat corn or flour tortilla, rolled it tight, and carried it for the noon meal. Beans and tortilla together made a complete filling lunch that held up cold in a saddlebag through the hottest afternoon. Anglo cowboys, who called beans everything from whistleberries to Pecos strawberries, quickly saw the wisdom of it and took up the habit themselves. Cheap, hearty, and endlessly reliable, the bean and tortilla roll fed a rider for pennies and never let him down. It's a quiet piece of history that the humble trail lunch of a 19th century vaquero would one day become one of the most popular foods in the country. Number 6. Cold red chili, chili con carne, left over from the night before, was a spicy comfort a cowboy carried whenever the cook allowed it. Chunks of tough beef simmered for hours with dried chilies, cumin, and garlic broke down into a thick, rich stew that only improved after a night by the fire. A rider spooned the cold leftovers onto a biscuit or into a tortilla, or simply ate it straight from a tin cup somewhere out on the flank of the herd. The heat of the chilies cut through the greasy monotony of trail food, and the peppers themselves, like the wild onions, quietly kept a man healthier than he knew. Chili was born on the Texas trails and in the border towns the drives passed through, cheap and fiery and made to stretch the toughest meat. A cold serving of it at noon was a jolt of flavor in a long, gray, dusty day. Number 5, vinegar pie was the trail's clever answer to a craving that couldn't be met, a dessert conjured out of almost nothing. Deep in cattle country, there were no lemons and no fresh fruit for weeks on end. So a resourceful cook faked the tang of lemon pie with a splash of vinegar, sugar, flour, and eggs baked into a crust. The result was sweet and sharp and startlingly good, and a cold wedge wrapped in cloth made a treasured pocket lunch for the lucky rider who got one. It cost only the cheapest pantry staples, yet it tasted like a treat from a proper kitchen back home. Cowboys who tasted a good vinegar pie remembered it for the rest of their lives, marveling that so much pleasure came from a bottle of vinegar. It stands as pure frontier ingenuity, the same spirit that turned every scrap and shortage into something worth eating. Number 4. Cold sourdough flapjacks carried the magic of the cook's sourdough keg out onto the open range. The same bubbling starter that made the outfit's bread also made tall stacks of flapjacks at the breakfast fire, tangy and light and beloved by every rider in camp. Whatever a man couldn't finish, he folded around a strip of bacon or spread with molasses and tucked away for noon. Cold, the flapjacks stayed soft enough to eat with pleasure, their sour tang holding up beautifully against salt and sweet. There was real comfort in unwrapping one far from the wagon, a piece of the morning still tender in your hand. Because a good sourdough starter took time and care to keep alive, flapjacks made from it were a point of pride for the cook. A cowboy chewing a cold flapjack at the back of the herd was tasting one of the true small luxuries the trail allowed. Number 3. Fried pies were the crown jewel a cowboy would ride miles out of his way to claim. The cook stewed dried apples or peaches until soft and sweet, folded the fruit into a circle of biscuit dough, crimped it shut, and fried the whole thing golden in hot lard. The result was a handheld pie, crisp outside and warm and sweet within, sturdy enough to wrap in cloth and carry into the saddle for the noon meal. Nothing lifted the mood of a trail crew like word that Cookie was making fried pies. Men who complained about everything went quiet at the taste of one. They took real time and precious sugar to make, so a batch was a gift, a sign that the outfit was doing well and the cook was in a generous mood. A fried pie eaten cold and sweet under a hard sun was, for many a cowboy, the best thing the whole drive ever offered. Number 2. Bear sign was the trail's word for donuts, and no food on the entire drive was loved more fiercely. When a cook was skilled and willing, he would mix a dough sweetened with sugar and spice, cut it into rings, and fry them in bubbling lard until they turned dark and golden, which is exactly how they earned their strange name. A good donut man could name his own price with the crew because cowboys would do his chores, stand his watch, and treat him like royalty for a fresh batch. Men pocketed the cooled bear sign to eat at noon, savoring every sweet, greasy bite far out on the range. Stories tell of cooks turning out donuts by the dozen deep into the night, while grateful cowhands begged for more. In a life of hardship and sameness, bear sign was joy you could hold in your hand, and it belongs near the very top of any list. Number 1, sourdough biscuits crowned every trail lunch as the true heart and soul of the Cowboys' diet, the one food that anchored the whole cattle era. From a keg of living starter that the cook guarded more carefully than his own life, warming it against cold nights so the yeast never died, came the biscuits that fed the outfit morning, noon, and night. Baked in a heavy Dutch oven buried in coals, they rose tall, tangy, and golden, and no chuck wagon breakfast was complete without a pan of them. Every rider carried a couple cold in his coat, and around them the rest of the noon meal was built. A biscuit split with bacon, dabbed with molasses, or dipped in cold beans was lunch across 1,000 miles of trail. Cheap, filling, and endlessly reliable, the sourdough biscuit was the food a cowboy could always count on. It was the taste of the trail itself, the plain, warm center of a hard and wandering life. From the humble corn dodger that opened our countdown to the beloved sourdough biscuit at the very top, these 25 forgotten trail lunches tell the story of a vanished world, one built on thrift, endurance, and the stubborn craft of feeding yourself from horseback. Which one would you have carried in your saddlebag? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten history from the Old West.